Okay, I want to do a quick walkthrough for this is really for prospective clients, but we'll put this up online. It's a good overview for folks considering this to understand. So at Conductor, we're active in the tax credit markets primarily as a sell side advisor. So we work with owners of solar projects to sell their tax credits to buyers. The buyer market consists of both institutions and high net worth individuals. They both play an important role there. We'll talk more about that as we go. I want to talk about a brief primer on the investment tax credit and specifically on recapture because that drives the structure, which drives the underwriting. It's not always intuitive why selling the tax credit would require an underwriting of the seller. So I'll talk through that. And then finally, we'll go through sort of a timeline and calendar with some key timing benchmarks to understand, particularly if you're putting a project in service in 2025. So let's get started. From a market standpoint, we have a couple of really good things. First, despite the general negative solar impacts around the OB3, as we're calling it now, that gave the market policy clarity. So tax credit transfer has absolute regulatory clarity at this point. So that's been a positive factor driving the market. We also, obviously, in general, have a strong economy and stock market. So those are also driving favorable tax credit transfer market right now. Because the market's so favorable, as often happens, these positive factors are creating just sheer volume of tax credit expected to come down the pipe, and that is in turn softening, or at least will soften the market to some extent. So the takeaway for now is that in late 2025, we have a very strong ITC market. So that's a good fact set to go into. It is absolutely dependent on market factors going into 2026. Okay. The way the ITC works is first, you have what we'll call tax credit basis. So if we start with you have an EPC contract, that's typically going to be all eligible for the tax credit. There are carve-outs in there for things like site prep, roofing, lots of other just non-PV elements that sometimes get included in these. But as a baseline, that's the basis on which the tax credit amount is determined. And then on top of that, utility upgrades. If you've paid your utility, PG&E or whoever for upgrades, that's typically includable. So this sets the baseline for the tax credit. You'll typically be starting at 30%. For tax credit transfer, we can include energy community is straightforward, plus 10%. In many cases, we can do domestic content adders that requires some additional reporting and compliance, but those are all potentially viable to get to a 40 or even 50% tax credit on that initial basis. Then what happens is every year for 5 years, 20% of that tax credit vests. So if the system is taken out of service, either destroyed because of financial distress, repossessed, or voluntarily sold, these types of factors trigger recapture. And so if at any point the system is subject to recapture, there is still an indemnity for the seller of the credit to pay back the buyer for the remaining amount that has not vested yet. So if you, for example, were to have the property either sold or repossessed at 2.5 years, there'd still be 60% to be recaptured at that point in time. And along with recapture, there's also a tax gross up baked into these so that you're liable if the indemnity payment is deemed taxable income. Then there can also be an additional payment to make the buyer of the credit whole from a tax perspective for any recapture. So because the buyer of the credit is subject to recapture over 5 years, they're looking to the seller, that's the owner of the PV system, for indemnification over that period of time. So a standard underwriting will consist of the obvious items, including financial statements and ownership. And we like talk about general corporate structure. So a couple things to keep in mind here. If this is the entity that owns the PV system, it's good to understand if there are any corporate entities above that, and then who the owners of that entity are. Also, to the extent that the real property is owned by a separate vehicle and leased, whether it's a related party or an unrelated third party, that's important to understand as well. Because so much of the recapture can be driven around the system being taken out of service, it's important to understand if there is a site lease, how long that site lease is for, and then in some cases, the owner of the real property, particularly if it's a related party, but even if it's not, could be subject to being either a guarantor or an SNDA concept, where even if there is some termination of the lease, the real property owner may commit to keeping the system in service so that it doesn't trigger a recapture. And the way those can be structured will be dependent on the specifics of a transaction. But good to understand overall that that's why underwriting in a tax credit sale is required. So let's talk about timeline. At this stage in 2025, if you've already placed a system in service or if you're hitting PTO here in late 2025, really recommend you're ready to start the process pretty much right away. So here's the way the timeline works. The absolute outside deadline for a buyer to purchase the credit is the corporate filing deadline inclusive of the extension, which is October 15th. If you happen to be a partnership, it's actually September 15th. But if we work on that October date and backwards from there, we'll actually tell you that the effective deadline you should shoot for is really like August 15th. And that's because the corporate buyers of these also need time to close their tax books, complete transactions, and just don't want to work right up to the wire. So somewhere in this time period here in September, you start losing buyers. So planning to close your transaction by August gets you best flexibility for pricing, execution, contract terms. Once you complete your system, and this is what Conductor, we advise our clients on this, you'll go through an IRS registration process. That's historically taken 4 to 6 weeks. And going forward, there are some reports that due to IRS staffing and other factors, that could take longer. So at this point, if we just assume a minimum of 2 months, but more realistically, it could be 3 months. If you're turning your system on in late 2025 and ready to start the IRS registration process here, if we assume it's 3 months, that's putting us still at March 31st, where we actually have the IRS will issue a registration number. And that's needed to transact the system. And no buyer, importantly, will move forward. They'll start doing diligence and having conversations. But before the buyers bring in their counsel to do real assessment, we're going to need that IRS registration number in hand. So what we'll do parallel process to that in here is we'll also put you in a process to get a cost seg report. And that's what the buyers use to validate and determine the tax credit basis, which we talked about previously. So that'll happen within this time span here. So several things, and we'll go through some other diligence items so that ideally by sometime in March or end of March, we're ready, everything packed up and ready to sell the credit. The other aspect happening in here is that, this is generally going to be a slower time for the market between March and, some point in the late spring or summer. So we're looking to really start transacting in this, say, 5-month time window in here. And that's fully then that gives us enough time to fully execute a transaction. But depending on the status of underwriting, so financial statements, other aspects with real property, specifics of the deal, we may want to cycle through or talk with more than one buyer to get the best combination of price, execution, and deal terms, as with any transaction. So we want to be able to preserve as much flexibility in this process as we can. So it's really important that coming into, particularly knowing that in the holidays, tax teams, administrative teams, legal teams are going to be tied up, it's really important to get documents together, ideally late in 2025, to be able to start that IRS process so that we can all be sitting with an IRS registration number in hand in March, with time to execute transactions and talk to multiple buyers. So this is what we do, and like to give our clients an initial overview of the process and what to expect. By all means, just please reach out to me and let's set up a call to talk through all of this in more detail. Thanks.